I will attack your friends. I will burn your home. I will do whatever it is I can do to inconvenience you in the way that you are inconveniencing me.
I want to introduce to you guys. He goes by Oreobandit in the Twitch chat, but to me, he is Kyle. He's been a longtime DM friend of mine. When I moved back to my hometown, he immediately welcomed me to his game. And ever since then, he's been crafting villains in all kinds of tabletop RPGs, D&D, Dresden Files, Pathfinder, and more. He's really good at playing bad guys, and I was so excited to have him talk about villains for this talk. Kyle, what's up? Welcome to the stream, friend.
Hey guys, hey chat. I'm sorry you have to listen to my real life voice instead of just dealing with my shit in text format. For my Dark Souls fans, I know the avatar is small, but it's Knight Solaire, so I'm hoping I get some Soulsborne love for that. And then yeah, I mean my background is a lot of D&D and tabletop role playing based. I've been playing for 14 or 15 years now. Doing a lot of DMing in that time, and then also getting to DM a lot of both good and bad guy aligned party games. So getting to really do the full spectrum of what does a bad guy look like based on who the protagonists are.
Yeah, I think if I may say too, I think you're a really good example as even though you don't necessarily take on like creative work professionally, I think you're very well read, uh, and so well read and kind of a good analyzer of content that you consume that it really shows off in the stories that you tell. So I'm very excited to have you on here, man.
Yeah,
Um,
happy to be here.
So let's just kind of jump in here as we for these guide through these guiding questions. Talk's gonna be an hour, and then there'll be a Q&A at the end of the day chat. So let's go with the first one. Very fundamental, but I think important to kind of for definitions wise for our talk. Fundamentally, what is a villain? What is their role in the story?
Good question. I looked at this, so just so chat knows, if any of my questions are bad, it's not because Andrew ambushed me. I got Ulysses sent over the questions ahead of time, and so if there's anybody who doesn't like my answer, it's totally my fault. But fundamentally, what is a villain? What is their role in the story? I feel like this is kind of a double-edged question,
Okay.
but really, like at their most basic level, a villain, right, is essentially an obstacle to be overcome.
Okay.
And there's a lot of aspects to that, right? When we talk about like what types of villains do you run into, I think that starts to become a much more nuanced answer to a very basic question.
Yeah.
But also, in a lot of ways, I think villains are the heroes of their story, right? I think they
Mhm.
serve both of those roles at the same time. And
Yeah.
the players really only experience one of those, or in your case, maybe the reader would only experience one of those answers, whereas the writer or the dungeon master or whoever it is, I feel like gets a really good look at both.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a really good point to kind of add to that basic definition of that you don't really see from a like a reader perspective of like they're the heroes of their own stories in a sense. So yeah, awesome.
Yeah,
Uh
and I guess to go a little deeper on that one, um, I think a lot of times it can be I see a lot of times where writers or dungeon masters will want the villain essentially to be a tool for exposition, which
right.
I think is totally fair, right? The villain is kind of there to provide context to the world, propel the plot, some of these key, critical factors that we need from them.
Right.
But also in that sense, right, where you see that other side of them. And I think sometimes as a reader, as a player, you can start to read into certain villains that you connect very strongly with. I found that like very small number of villains as like a reader. I'm an avid enjoyer of fantasy and sci-fi and things like that. There have been a few villains over the stories that I'm like almost more interested in them than the protagonist.
Yeah.
And you start to see in like certain ways they also react to external stimuli, right? They start
Hmm.
to react to the story changing around them. They are not just a force of nature where the story is concerned. They are also kind of like a piece on the board, if you will.
Yeah. Amazing. Let's kind of uh go to the second question here because I think from that one we're starting to brush up on a lot of the other questions, which is good, which is good.
Yeah.
So let's go to our second guiding question here to guide the conversation. So, what are the building blocks for creating villains in a story? What other elements are being considered aside from the quality of being opposed to the protagonist?
Okay, this is a good one. I think the number one building block for me when I sit down as a DM, right? That's the
Yeah.
medium where normally I'm going to create a bad guy. When I sit down as a DM, I like to create a bad guy as if that's not what they are,
Hmm.
right? I give them their abilities, I give them their personality, I give them their alignment, right? I give them all these things, but most importantly, like I try to build them as a player would build their character,
Hmm.
right? I fundamentally think that that's kind of a DM's role is each player has a character that they really get to flesh out and they get to deep dive in and they get to become that person, whereas the DM is more of a revolving door or like putting on different hats. But to that degree, all of those characters need to be fleshed out enough that you can be that bad guy for the time being.
Right.
So I almost like to build them as if they were a character, or a character that a player would build. And then the very last thing I do is ask myself just one question, which is how would I set them at odds with the party?
Hmm.
In what way will they come into conflict with the party?
I like that answer a lot too, Kyle, because especially from a tabletop role playing standpoint, and while you're in the developmental drafts of the story, where the plot isn't as stiff as you want it, uh, having the personality of your villain be nailed down is really good because uh, it makes them more reactive and malleable to the player actions, or if stuff changes in your story. Because every DM knows that plans don't survive very long when you have a rambunctious party or any party really.
Certainly, it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't survive contact with the party. That's for sure.
And having the personality rather than just having like, oh yeah, this is what they do and this is what I want them to do. If you have them like, okay, this is how they deal with their problems normally, this is how they feel about certain things, having their behaviors more nailed down tends to be more effective because when the party throws like a curveball at you, you at least have a base standpoint of, okay, that plan didn't work, but this villain behaves like this in certain ways, or usually he likes having all the information presented to him. When a new factor enters in, he usually kind of recedes and says, okay, I don't know what this is. I don't fully understand it. So I'm going to delay this conflict for a while. Or you have a villain that's morally just like, F it, we ball. I don't care. I'm just going to go all out no matter what goes through. Having those behaviors kind of nailed down really makes for really a better storytelling experience because then it feels like the characters have more agency because they can do whatever they want and still have a story. But for the DM, it's like you have more space to be flexible.
Yeah, and I think for me as a DM, it helps me kind of navigate some of those difficult story or narrative moments like what you're talking about, right? Where the players do something absolutely unexpected. My DM style in particular, I know Ulysses has played with me. If anybody else in chat has played with me, it's very much an improv heavy, because I like to emphasize player choice. I would
Hmm.
always rather do what the players find interesting rather than what I have prepared for them. And the way that that is most, I guess, successful is by having those personalities and those goals, like you said, nailed down so that it takes me not even a second to know how my villain would react,
Hmm.
whether he be the corrupt town guard all the way to, the lich who's trying to escape the multiverse and exist outside of time so that he can ascend to godhood, right?
Yeah.
Whichever type of bad guy, whatever caliber of bad guy I'm piloting, I like to have their overall goal, their personality, their strengths and weaknesses, how they got to their position, right? Those kind of things figured out, so I know, okay, in case of party does X, villain does Y, right? Whatever their direct result would be. I also think that helps me tell the story around some of the more like glaring plot hole questions.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know, there's certain media that I watch or I consume, and I'm just looking at him like, why does the villain not rock up on these guys when he's clearly over leveled and ready to squish them like a bug, right?
Right.
He knows they're going to be a problem, or she knows they're going to be a problem. Just kill them now and be done with it. Well, when you flesh out the villain more, right, along with those goals comes problems.
Right.
The villain has problems beyond the party. And it is not until, if you're a good DM or if you're a good writer or you're good whatever it is, as soon as the party becomes the villain's number one problem, that is the moment you are ready for those two characters or groups of characters to become on a narrative collision course.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't want that to happen a moment too soon,
Yeah.
because if you let it go too late, it won't feel rewarding, and the party or the adventurers or whoever they are, the protagonist, will roll over your villain. And if you let it happen too soon, obviously it's an incredibly one-sided fight the other way,
Yeah.
and the protagonist or the party may lose. You may have to bail them out narratively, which feels less rewarding,
Yeah.
or they may just die outright, right? And they have to start over.
Yeah.
So I think that factors into it quite a bit. Is having that fleshed out not only lets you make those real-time decisions, but it lets you time the villain and the narrative pacing to be very finely tuned, exactly what you're looking for as a
Mhm.
storyteller.
Yeah, exactly. Uh kind of it kind of leads into with that, like the timing of villains. I think question 3 might have some insight of like when characters get challenged by what kinds of villains. So we'll go to question 3 here, which is are there different types of villains that you want to have in the same story? Are there some types you favor over others? Do they all have a place?
Oh man, welcome to my TED Talk. So this is one that I probably looked at the most out of the group.
Yeah.
So I'll answer the easy question first, very simply. Do they all have their place? Yes, of course.
Mhm.
Every type of villain has a place. You just need the right circumstances. You need the right heroes. You need the right, whatever it is. Every villain has their place. They're all narratively compelling in the right situation. Um, are there different types of villains that you want to have in the same story? I think so. I think there are different types of villains that are very helpful. I should clarify. When I say villains in this sense, sometimes I mean antagonists.
Yeah.
And the difference there, right? A villain, of course, is clearly the bad guy. There's somebody that cannot survive in their current form direct conflict with the protagonist or the heroes.
Mhm.
Either they need to drastically change, they need to be defeated, they need to be imprisoned, whatever the case may be. An antagonist or an anti-hero obviously can run kind of parallel to the party in a very darker or lighter shade, depending on the group, but still work towards the same goal.
Mhm.
I think both of these fall into, for me as a storyteller, I use three very broad categories.
All right.
The first one and the easiest one is the force of nature. Right? They are a villain. They are an antagonist. They are whatever role they're filling, but they cannot be bargained with. They cannot be really outwitted. Maybe
Mhm.
they're more of a entity that has to be overcome in some way. I suppose you could outwit them in some cases, but my best example of this is, like, think of the bad guy in any kaiju movie. Right? There's no villain from a Godzilla movie that you're gonna bargain with, right? Godzilla just needs to get in there and go to work, right? They need to catch these hands and this atomic breath. I
Yeah.
think that's a good example of,
Yeah.
like, in D&D, the Tarask,
Mhm.
right? The Tarask is awake. You have only a couple options, which is kill it, put it back to sleep, or point it a different direction. There's no
Right.
getting it to sign a treaty. There's no bartering with it. There's not really anything you can do about it. Um, that takes me to my next, I guess, category, which is one that I probably find the most interesting to pilot, but is not my favorite to consume in media, which I find interesting personally.
Yeah.
But my favorite to pilot is a failed protagonist. I think
Oh,
there are a
okay.
lot of villains that fit into this role where there's only one or two key experiences or attributes that are different from them to a hero or a party member or a protagonist, but that very small deviation in such a bombastic and larger than life person causes a major change,
Mhm.
right? It's like removing one card from a card pyramid that's 1,000 feet high, right? You take one out and the resulting effect is catastrophic.
Right.
You change just a few things and you'll see a massive difference. um, I think a really good example of this from media, I like to use examples because I think it gives people a look inside my head a little bit.
Yeah,
I think
for
a good
sure.
example of a failed protagonist would be like Heath Ledger's Joker from The
Mhm.
Dark Knight. This is a character that is incredibly courageous, not in a particularly good way, but he takes
Yeah.
a lot of personal risk, right?
Yeah.
He's not the bad guy that's in a chair 1,000 miles away in his tower commanding his minions.
No.
He's robbing the bank. He's trying to assassinate the mayor personally, right? He's doing all these things. He's incredibly intelligent, right? He
Yeah.
takes
Very.
over the underworld of this massive city as a newcomer, as a new
Mhm.
player. He's not even well established in this environment,
Yeah.
and quickly rises to the point where he can take on Batman, our protagonist, our hero,
Mhm.
over the course of not a very long amount of time, right? Narratively,
Yeah.
in
No.
a
For
rather
sure. Yeah.
short time, he's a real challenge. And his goal, right? His motivating factor is that he's lost his faith in humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody, that's the key for me, because somebody who cares enough about the way humanity acts as a species and has lost their faith in them, somebody who cares so much that those actions are their direct result of that loss of faith, had you tweaked just a few things, could have been, the greatest philanthropist or another
Right.
hero
Yeah.
or anything else that Gotham might have seen, right? In those just very subtle differences between Batman.
Yeah. Yeah. That even kind of calls, and that kind of really even showcases itself when he kind of inflicts that status onto Harvey Dent, who eventually becomes Two-Face in that movie too. We're taking like
Ex-
a paragon of humanity, tweak that one thing, and then a problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think you see in some ways, I think you see in that example specifically Joker's corruption of really what he saw in the mirror, right? What he
Mhm.
could have been. And whether he realizes it or not, whether he grapples with it or not, it's hard to tell, right? Obviously, it's a down and dirty action movie. I don't
Right.
really watch it to analyze it that much, but I think it's a fitting example in this case.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Absolutely.
turning that could have been protagonist into something that more resembled himself makes
Hmm.
for kind of a vicious cycle, right? Lets him
Yeah.
know that his work will be continued even after he's gone.
Hmm. And then
And then the
you got a third one, right?
Yeah, the last one is a villain who is the protagonist where they're from. They
Mhm.
are the good guy from their perspective, or
Yeah.
from their people's perspective. I think we talked about this a little bit in person, but I think my favorite example of this is from the movie Serenity.
Hmm.
For my sci-fi fans out there, it's the movie that follows the show Firefly. Um, in the movie, the bad guy, I think, is simply known as the Operative,
Hmm.
and he he represents, in a lot of ways, he's a force of nature, right? He's
Yeah.
backed by this massive galactic spanning government. He has unlimited resources, unlimited access. But you see a lot of times where he does truly villainous actions, right? In an
Yeah.
effort to put pressure on Malcolm Reynolds and the crew of the Serenity. He is, killing children, killing unarmed civilians in an attempt to flush him out to further his own goal, with the understanding, in his opinion, that it is 100% for the greater good.
Hmm.
And that if 2, 3, 4 kids need to die, so be it, right? Or
Yeah.
100. He is attempting to create a better future for an entire galaxy. And so there's almost no price that he can be confronted with on an individual level that will ever outweigh his goal.
Yeah.
And if you were to view that movie from his perspective, there might be things he does that are questionable, things that you kind of raise an eyebrow at. But if you got the benefit of his internal monologue and the people that he's taking his orders from, he would absolutely be the good guy
Yeah.
based on his own perspective.
Yeah. I think that perspective is that key thing to really hone in on when you're talking about creating that type of villain who believes that they are the protagonist of their own story. Because from their because I mean, we see it even with protagonists that you follow in a story, that sometimes they do questionable things, and it might, and then they might tangle with it for a little bit and have some moral questions about it. But having that be mirrored in a protagonist, in a villain, and makes them more complex and more interesting for the
Yeah.
character, for readers or players to invest in. So yeah, absolutely. I love those three categories. That's awesome. That's actually really good talking about the operative, because then we have our next question. It's hard to have a villain without villainous acts. Is there a recipe for making a villain's actions memorable while not generic?
Memorable while not generic. I think Honestly, I feel like I come away a little bit as a lazy storyteller on this question, just because I let my right, obviously in my medium of tabletop role playing games,
Yeah.
I typically let my players show me right the soft spots.
Mm-hmm.
My players over the course of the game should show me what they care about and what they don't, right? Where they enjoy spending their time, what they enjoy doing, what their pet projects are. All of these things are part of their character. I feel like that is where villainous acts are best played out on a antagonistic level, right?
Mm-hmm.
When protagonists come into conflict with villains. Um, a good example of this is, you care so much about the natural order and the nature spirits you represent. Don't you worry, we have a guy who hunts them down specifically. Right?
Yeah.
That is clearly set at odds with that player.
Right.
Whereas I think there are other acts that need to further a villain's goal, right? That maybe the party is unaware of, right? Maybe
Mm-hmm.
the party is not on the villain's radar yet, or the heroes and the protagonists have not quite made it onto the villain's shortlist yet. And so they are going about their day-to-day as if they don't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And in those cases, I typically, if I've got my step one right, which is I've got my villain completely fleshed out, or as fleshed out as I think I can get them without more information from the interactions with the players.
Mm-hmm.
Once I have that, if I need villainous acts, I figure out, okay, what is my villain's goal? What is my villain's short-term or long-term goal in this upcoming, 1, 2, 3 sessions or chapters or what have you? And then I look at it and I say, okay, what would a villain reasonably need to do or go about doing to achieve those goals? And then really, in most cases, I set about achieving them in the most amoral way possible.
Yeah.
Whatever maximizes efficiency and minimizes cost, and oftentimes at the expense of collateral damage or things like that.
Yeah.
And typically I find that those actions off screen, if that's the formula you use, that's a good way to communicate to the party, hey, this is the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
Once that's been communicated and the party comes into direct conflict with him, I feel it's easy to develop that much more personal antagonistic relationship between them by hitting the party's soft targets, because typically a villain will only do that when it's playing tit for tat.
Yeah.
Right? You the party have bothered me. I have tried to kill you, that has failed, so now I will bother you in some other way,
Mm-hmm.
right? I will attack your friends. I will burn your home. I will do whatever it is I can do to inconvenience you in the way that you are inconveniencing me.
And I think you've honed in on that point where I think a big part of villainous actions is it's personal for the protagonists and the protagonists of what they care about. So yeah, that's awesome.
Makes me think of the absolutely excellent Street Fighter movie that everybody should watch from the 90s, which is You Killed My Father and You Burned My Village. And the villain's response is, that must have been an important day for you. For me, it was Tuesday.
Yeah.
My boy M. Bison.
My boy Bison gave no fucks that day. All right. Let's go to this next question here. And I think this has been this type of question has been a fun one for all of our guest speakers. So I'm curious what you have to say on it. What separates run-of-the-mill villains from iconic ones you always remember? Any examples from popular media you can think of, and why were they so memorable or accomplished for you?
This is a tough one. I think there's a couple ways that a villain can stand out.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're all slightly different, but I think the common thread that they have is success.
Mm-hmm.
Villains stand out when they are successful, or when they are particularly frightening for the protagonist or the party, right? When the stakes are high, the pressure is very palpable. One of my favorite takes on this is when a villain is able to beat a protagonist or a hero at their own game.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Whether that's just because they're better at it, whether it's because the hero has gotten, a little cocky, the hubris has come into play. I think a good example of this is because of this, she is one of my favorite villains and very memorable. And I find that this is not a common occurrence amongst avid readers of the Dresden Files.
Mm-hmm.
But I think Mavra, the Black Court vampire, when she appears in book 3, Grave Peril,
yeah,
and spoilers, the book's been out for a while, so chat, if you're upset, cry me a river. But um Mavra is able to get one over on the protagonist, right, Harry Dresden, and is able to force him kind of into a deal. She backs him into a corner where he is essentially forced to hand over a a lexicon or a tome of incredibly powerful necromantic knowledge that obviously a black court vampire is going to do nothing but bad things with. and Harry is so thoroughly outclassed both in combat and in preparation, right? He's been outthought. He can be outfought, right? He's out of options entirely. That made me want to see that character again more than anything else.
Right. Yeah.
More than her backstory, more than her, because I feel like there, as a reader or as a player or whoever it is, that is the perfect setup for a win-win on the repeat visit. Because as long as the storyteller remains true to the character, you will either, as a reader especially, get a lot of narrative payoff in watching the hero take their revenge on the villain, or seeing it done again in a different way. The villain continues to outsmart the hero, but in a different way, because obviously our hero can't fall for it more than once. And so I think it is a really good setup for a very engaging bad guy. And the best bad guys, you can get one or two interactions with the protagonist with before they finally get that narrative payoff of their vengeance.
Yeah.
And that makes it just all the better.
Yeah, for sure. I think especially the narrative payoff aspect is something that about just storytelling craft that you have to really practice and master at when you write, like longer stories or write these longer campaigns, because having villains essentially just be like kind of one-off, you don't get as much of a narrative payload just because you're not able to store as much content. But when you have these exchanges of defeat, win, defeat, win, defeat, win, it almost creates a lore in it of itself and creates that relationship that characters sometimes get more invested in than like the actual plot itself of like Archer events. They're just like, I want to see these guys tango, and every time they tango, it's so cool to see, and that itself is like memorable.
Absolutely. And for me, like in a tabletop RPG setting, it happens so organically.
Yeah.
If you've really fleshed out your bad guy and you know that it's a bad guy that you want to be around for a little while, maybe you get one over on your players, and then you present the players the opportunity to take a little narrative justice on this bad guy who's wronged them before. And then you bounce back and forth like that. That rivalry and that lore starts to grow between really the DM and the players, as well as their characters and the bad guy. And it becomes fun both in and out of the game, right? It's inside jokes. You can bounce back and forth. You can see that relationship, that rivalry develop. I think what separates it from quote unquote run-of-the-mill bad guy is, I guess, going back to my categories, I find run-of-the-mill bad guys are bad guys that basically get slotted into the category they don't belong in. So a good example of that would be like, say in a superhero movie, a bunch of goons, right? Whether they're faceless monsters, whatever the case may be, they're hired help, whoever they are. A good example maybe is Thanos's hand from Infinity War, right? His generals, who seem very interesting, but we never really get the chance to learn much about them.
No, not at all.
They're rather powerful. They're impactful on screen, but we don't really know too much lore about them. Therefore, they're kind of caught in this dissonance between being a force of nature, which they are because of their effect on screen, but doesn't quite fit them because we know there is a backstory there. They're intelligent. They have good lines. They clearly work for a very scary individual. If nothing else, there has to be something just in their recruitment process, right? How did you come to be in Thanos' service? And we never see that. So they're caught between being a force of nature and being the protagonist in their own story, right? Every one of them thinks they're the good guy. They believe in the work that they're doing, that their master is doing, right? And so when they're caught between these two and they kind of settle somewhere in between, not that it's always the case, but oftentimes I find when a bad guy is maybe mislabeled or put in the wrong bucket, and not to say that this is a bad thing, but you are setting them up to be a quote unquote goon.
Yeah.
right? They are just an obstacle. They are a narrative hurdle for your hero to overcome, to show the difficulty and the hero's journey. And that's okay, but that is oftentimes how I can kind of see it coming.
Yeah, and speaking about relationships, that kind of perfectly segues into our sixth question here. We have, what are the important aspects in the relationship between a villain and the protagonists? Is it solely goal oriented? And I think that second question we've kind of already is like, no, it's not just solely goal oriented. But
Right.
but let's talk about it.
It's not straightforward just about goal oriented. There are some bad guys that I think you can get away with that, but they're very specific.
Mhm.
They're sociopathic in the extreme, right? They feel no personal attachment to the player, their goals, the hero, right, what have you. But I think by and large, every relationship between protagonist and antagonist or protagonist and villain starts out as goal oriented. That is
Mhm.
the way that they begin, because really it's just an opposition of ideals in
Right.
most cases, right? I'm here to be the king that the kingdom needs, and the hero looks at you and says tyrant, right? It is just two sides of the same coin.
Right.
However, as they come into conflict with each other, that relationship cannot continue to exist. Or if
Mhm.
it does, it is the foundation for what grows on top of that, right? They become, in some ways, they become friends, right? They know each other better than their friends do,
Yeah.
right? If it consumes them, right? They start to think like their nemesis. Lovers, enemies, right? Whatever relationship they begin to serve for each other, in a lot of ways they become closer to each other in a really terrible way, than any of their more positive relationships around,
Yeah.
because in that very core relationship of protagonist and villain or antagonist, that is so central to every story, whether it be book or tabletop or what have you. It almost has to be that personal for the reader to get the payoff at
Yeah.
the end.
I think I really like this idea as well that you've presented, of almost that between as the villain and the protagonist start conflicting and start interacting, when you're trying to make that believable like villain, almost that they're like learning from each other, of like when they're starting to think like the other person, like the fact that that is even happening when you're trying to have that memorable villain that follows the protagonists in a way that constantly challenges them, like the way that you constantly challenge something that you're going to interact with is to learn from it, to learn its goals, to learn how it acts. And then once you've reached that level, okay, now that they've adapted, how do I learn from those adaptations and stuff? And what we've talked about before of like building that lore and building those aspects from the interaction and how things kind of play out, I think is interesting and compelling.
Yeah, and I think really that relationship, not that I'm exclusively working in triplets here, but I feel like that relationship really ends kind of for me in three major ways, which
Mhm.
is I obviously represent the villain's perspective in many cases, so you'll have to forgive me my choice of perspective. But as a villain, I look at the protagonist, and I really, at the very end of the relationship, I come down to three possible outcomes of that relationship, which is I could have been you,
Mhm.
right? The villain sees in the protagonist at the end what they could have been, which I feel like most strongly represents the failed protagonist.
Yeah.
Um, what think of what we could do together, right? When the villain sees finally their equal, right?
Yeah.
Somebody who understands them, who is their match, and maybe just has a different viewpoint. That I think most commonly comes out in the person who is the protagonist in their own story, so that they're
Right.
not they're never against the idea of an ally, even their sworn nemesis in this case. And then lastly, it is the most direct, I feel, which is I have to build my triumph. Your bones will be the foundation for my victory. Basically,
Yeah.
is that you and I are so at odds that whatever age comes after this, whichever one of us wins, that time will be successful because the other is dead.
Mhm.
Right. That is how against each other we have been set.
Right.
Um, and I feel like those three are kind of naturally where I find myself as a storyteller. I'm sure there's others that are
Mhm.
completely viable, but those are the ones that I run into most commonly.
Yeah. Uh, let's go to this seventh question here. I'm really curious on this one for from your perspective, which is in making a villain's weakness or flaw. Is there a skill to make it narratively compelling?
I don't know if there's necessarily a skill to make it narratively compelling.
Mhm.
I think there is a mindset to making it narratively compelling, and it's twofold. The first one is the one that we've been talking about the whole way through, which is treat your villain like your protagonist if you're the bad guy, right?
Mhm.
If it's my job to be the bad guy, I'm not the bad guy, I'm the hero. The
Mhm.
heroes are the bad guys.
Yeah.
And so in that way, making their flaw is maybe they're too obsessed with their goal. Maybe, they can't see the forest through the trees. These are all very common ones that we run into. I think similarly, another level down from that, the mentality that I tried to keep is never take yourself too seriously,
Mhm.
right? As a writer, as a storyteller, one of my favorites, and you were a part of this game, so you can tell me if you agree.
Yeah.
But I feel like I got a lot of narrative payoff as a bad guy personally. I had a very terrible, diabolical, genius level intellect wizard that had habitually gotten one over on the party,
Yeah.
had made a full contact sport out of outwitting the party. And because I had built him up so much and we had that relationship, I thoroughly enjoyed making his weakness something very human,
Yeah.
which is his extreme OCD. Right? When
Yeah.
you guys made a mess of his workshop, you moved all his things, you touched everything, you fucked up his books, you messed up all of his current rituals and potion making and everything like that. And he came down and he saw, one, you had messed up the order of his life.
Mhm.
Two, you had violated the sanctity of his most sacred place. And three, you had the audacity to breathe while within his vicinity, right? All of those put together, they don't seem like they should be a fitting weakness for a big bad guy. But if you do that, and you do that in combination, even the incredibly hyper intelligent wizard who is diabolical and making deals and trying to bring about the ruination of an empire and a country can still lose his shit and
Yeah.
and can be baited into making suboptimal choices based on how just angry he is with the people right in front of him.
Yeah. We talked about a little bit about this because we had Salka, or you know him as Brian. We talked about character flaws, and I think something that you've kind of honed in on about not taking yourself too seriously is that flaws have this weird ability to humanize subjects, and part of making, I think, villains having villains have a fan base, I guess, is a weird way to say it, or like having villains be cool for audiences is like, despite having these epic machinations and these epic powers and being able to outsmart certain villains, having them have these like very human aspects somehow makes them like even more compelling. Just because, like with that wizard, it's like the fact that he was OCD, made sense because like he's a wizard and all that stuff, but him being able to like lose his shit is, despite having all these machinations, made that moment like far more compelling. Because I feel like sometimes if their flaw is like so alien that it feels like a hassle to deal with, I feel like you don't get as much narrative payoff and it doesn't feel as compelling. They feel almost too inhuman to be to be likable, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely agree. But yeah, we were talking about villains and how their flaws can sometimes humanize them.
Yeah.
I was going to add to that. I think my favorite part of that is it's such a critical moment, but it can be so small. Is how you have your villain act in that moment is their truest self,
Mm-hmm.
and so you need to get it right. In that case, right, the wizard. Um, After being, completely having his complete workshop upended, having the people who he thinks he's better than get one over on him and do all these things, his reaction to that is to immediately deploy as much magic as possible to impose his will on the immediate surrounding creation, which I felt, to me, right, as the person who
Mm-hmm.
made him, that was the truest sense of his character. In in Serenity, going back to my old example, right? The operative at the very end, spoilers again for anybody who hasn't watched Serenity, but when the crew of the Firefly kind of gets one over on the operative, they bring the Reavers to his fleet. He's deployed an entire fleet to stop their single ship. They bring Reavers, which are like space pirate cannibals, to attack him. And he, in that moment, is kind of defeated, right? He's looking around. It's completely not what he expected. He freezes for an instant. And then he says, right afterwards, target the Reavers, somebody fire. In that case, you see, okay, if you strip that character down to his basest instinct, he is aggression. He is a blade wielded by the galactic government. He is really nothing more than a weapon in human form. I think that is where you see the soul of a villain. And usually it's the very last thing you see before they die, right? Before they're defeated by the party. It is kind of where they're most vulnerable.
Just even noticing that moment, I think is just really, really awesome that you've pointed out that like when they've been one-upped, seeing that moment of weakness and seeing like the base form of the character. If we go back to the wizard that we outsmarted, I really like the example of him trying to impose order and his place in what he sees as his hierarchy, trying to impose it with just like blasting magic once we've stripped him down of everything. Having that contrast of like when he was at his height of power of like wheeling and dealing, getting one over us, a strategic mind, and then at his base form being like, okay, no, I'm blasting at you guys. I think it is just more compelling as a villain of something that it will. I will forever remember that fucking wizard. Killing him felt so good.
I'm glad it was supposed to.
Let's go to and it's nice that the questions are kind of leading into each other. So let's go to guiding question number 8, which is villains and arcs. Villains can go through personal development across a story and grow alongside with the heroes, sometimes even become heroes themselves or worse villains. What are the important factors in facilitating this kind of transformation?
Yeah, I think this is honestly probably the most important part, right? Is how do you want your villain to grow alongside your players? Some storytellers, some dungeon masters try to have their villains spring forth from their forehead fully formed, much like Athena. And I think that can be extremely difficult. It's just hard to make a villain fully formed without the input that you will get from the party. And I think this applies even to writing as well. You can have an idea of what you want your hero to be like, but I feel like you, as the author, right, you know a lot of behind the scenes, but you kind of discover very niche parts of your protagonist's personality as you write them.
Yeah,
right.
For sure.
And it hits you. I mean, if I'm allowed to use a biblical reference, right, it strikes you on the road to Damascus, right? Like you're hit with an epiphany of, oh my God, this is what this character would do in this case. It's almost divine revelation, right? Yeah. And so I think this is just as important with the villain as well. They need to grow alongside your hero, alongside your protagonist. I think for me, the way that I do it personally is I think there are very specific moments in storytelling that are very cool where the villain turns the corner, right? They have now become a protagonist. And I think it's nice to do a very slow burn where they start to kind of correct course very gradually. And then I like for there to be a very decisive moment where they're made to choose, what will you be, right? Who will you be? And when they make that choice, to me, as a reader, as a viewer, as a dungeon master, as a storyteller, to me, that is one of the most satisfying things to narrate. Yeah. I love watching characters turn that corner, both good and bad, right? Whether they become a hero or they become a villain. But I think the important thing is having that fleshed out goal and personality. You can respond to the stimuli, but it shouldn't be, you shouldn't be unaffected by it. You're right. Meaning, if you get outsmarted by the party, that villain maybe should take more time to think about their next steps. And if it happens again, they can now go in one of two directions. They can become enraged by it, and they can begin to act irrationally, or they can sink even deeper into, how do I outwit these people? They keep getting one over on me. How do I become, in your question, right, a worse villain? Yeah. How do I impose my will on them?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's a real important part of it, right? Being true to your foundation, and then knowing as a storyteller, do you want that moment for that character? Do you want that single defining moment where they turn that corner? And if yes, then I start to kind of work backwards from there.
Yeah. I almost feel like, and perhaps we could talk about this a little. We've talked a lot about like, villains' goals and like villain behaviors, and I feel like sometimes when it comes to a villain and their arcs and like kind of being struck on the road to Damascus of like these revelations, sometimes villains will discover that the goal that they're currently pursuing is not their actual goal, that fulfills them the most. Like they are on their own road to discovery, just like a protagonist is. So like if we take, for example, like a villain that slowly becomes a hero in the story, perhaps like a narrative train we could follow is like, a villain tried to be a hero once, didn't work out so well. And he's like, okay, I'm going to throw my cards to this other side because it seems like the good guy side isn't working. But then he encounters another hero and they start winning and start seeing success where they did not. And that kind of inputs that doubt into the villain's mind of like, oh shit, like did I just give up too soon? Like what's going on? Is this really? And like they're on a road to discovery themselves, to which then they make the ultimate confrontation of, hey, are they going to keep on going on this path, or are they going to switch sides again and do this one last time?
Right. I think to that point, I think in a lot of cases there are villains that really they're just antagonists,
Mhm.
and they won't know that until they meet a villain.
Yeah.
A good example of this, I tried to diversify my examples from all the media I consume. When I read your questions, this is my one anime example. So for the weebs in chat, you're welcome. But the anime Rurouni Kenshin is very near and dear to my heart. I watched it as a kid. And it follows Kenshin Imura, the Batosai, who is this legendary swordsman from the Meiji Restoration, right? The revolution against the Tokugawa shogunate. And he's kind of at odds with a character who becomes a government man, which is a very interesting arc for him because he is a samurai of the shogunate in the war. He fights on the side of the shogunate, and he is the leader of a squad of swordsmen called the Shinsengumi, who are actively hunting the Batosai but can't quite ever catch him. And the leader, this captain, is an extremely accomplished swordsman and kind of turns government assassin because the only skill he has is with a blade.
Right.
And the only way he can employ that in the new era is for the government. And it's his name is Saito. And for a lot of the series, whenever they meet, it's almost on sight. He is one of the few characters that can make Kenshin Imura, who's really turned the corner into this wholesome protagonist, revert to his old self, right? He pulls his blade immediately, and they set about trying to kill each other pretty much every time they see each other. And it's not until they run into the real big bad guy of the series, whose name is Shishio, who is not only a murderer and a psychopath, but is kind of collecting this very Legion of Doom and is looking to undermine the government in such a way that he can return it to the shogunate, but under his own command.
Right.
And when they both run into this character, not only is his goal so abhorrent to them, but they are both individually so outmatched by him that they are forced kind of to accept some things about each other, that neither one of them is really as bad as they thought. It could always be worse, right? But it's not until they're confronted by that external narrative pressure that they are forced as characters to make that realization.
Absolutely. I think too that's kind of, and I know this question was a while back, but like that's kind of the benefit of sometimes having multiple types of villains, is because villains will learn from each other as well, of like where they want to be in the world. Of this villain sees like this force of nature and perhaps is like, okay, like I need to like team up with someone to deal with this because this is a real problem. Or they throw sides, like, oh, this is clearly the better truth of the universe, I'll throw sides. Or they have other goals. So I think that's a perfect summation of like the importance of having villains be able to learn and change. Let's go to our question 9 here. I know we're running over time, but I think this talk is very beneficial for a lot of writers. Let's go to guiding question number 9, which is: a fitting end Is there a skill to making a villain's defeat compelling and satisfying? We talked about this a little.
Yeah, I think in some cases, right? Again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but going back to TTRPG, right? Tabletop gaming, uh, the players tell me what's satisfying in a lot of ways. I feed off of what my players are striving for, the plans that I hear them make. I try to arrange things so that you guys will get the maximum amount of narrative payoff, right? That makes it kind of easy for me personally as I DM or as I consume media. One of the things that I find most fitting in certain cases is I very much feel like I personally adhere to the philosophy or the mentality that villains should get the end that they deserve, not the one that they want.
Yeah.
Meaning, like, an example from fantasy that I pulled for anybody who's a House of the Dragon fan. I'm sorry, this is coming from Fire and Blood, which is the source material. It's kind of spoilers, but in Fire and Blood, there's a Kingsguard member named Sir Criston Cole who kind of goes rogue when he beds the princess, but then she doesn't want to marry him. Things go poorly for him. He joins the other side in the Civil War, and he kind of sets about trying to destroy what was this one-time object of his desire. And he really puffs himself up in his head. You can feel his main character syndrome, honestly, in a lot of ways, right? He feels slighted. He feels like the character of his own story. It's about setting things right and obtaining his own justice. And I really enjoy that character dies on a battlefield outside of the capital with very little narrative tension. He has very little to do with the story in his death. And I like that because he gets the death that he deserves, which is a kind of obscure one because it fits the way that he actually interacts with the story, not the way that he perceives himself to be a part of the story. Right? To the story, he is just some Kingsguard. He is somebody who's passing a blade, right? He is decent with a sword. He's more intelligent than your average bear and he's got all his teeth, right? That's about all he's got going for him in this setting. But yet he puffs himself up to be prince and king and right, all these things that he feels like are so narratively compelling. And so I really like the fact that he dies on a battlefield somewhere in the middle of nowhere fighting for a cause that really has nothing to do with him, because that is a soldier's lot in life.
You're right. It's kind of the what's the way to say that? I think you actually summed it up pretty well. It's like the ending that they deserve, and perhaps like the fate they've been trying to escape this whole time, and because they've been perhaps going about it the wrong way, right? When they meet their end finally, it's what they've constantly been trying to avoid in a certain sense. Let's go to the last question here. And to you, what is the most important aspect of a villain that you feel is underlooked or underappreciated?
This is a tough one. Underlooked or underappreciated. I think in a lot of cases, I think in a lot of cases, the aspect of a villain that is underlooked or underappreciated, which I very personally enjoy when it is showcased, I like to see their real supporters. Meaning, I like it when you see a villain who is terrible and horrible and viewed through the protagonist's perspective as clearly the worst thing ever, not even a person anymore, a thing to be dealt with. I like when that villain is shown to have real love and affection from the group that they are supporting or the people that they are representing, whether they be bad guys or not, whether they be underrepresented or not. An example of this that I feel like was missed is in going back to Marvel, in Guardians of the Galaxy, Ronan the Accuser goes on his rampage for Kree justice, right, for his people. I wish we got to see the Kree faction that supported him, that wanted revenge for the wrongs done to their people. I wish we got to see Ronan the Accuser, one, from the Guardians' perspective and from Nova Corps' perspective as this terrible, megalomaniacal, ultra-powerful terrorist, basically, is what he is. but I would have loved to have seen that turned on its head, to see him be portrayed as a savior, as a messianic figure, as an avenging angel, right? Someone who would right the wrongs across the stars for his people,
Yeah.
and see those juxtaposed. Because very few villains, in my experience or from my storytelling, I think there should be very few villains that are ubiquitously bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
I think everybody should have some supporters,
Right.
and some genuine supporters, not just out of fear.
Right. I almost think of German sports. I think of in the Dracula animation, or Castlevania. His two, I forget what they call them, the Flesh Crafters.
Oh, the Forge Masters,
The Forge
yes,
Masters.
Isaac and Hector.
Yeah, Isaac and Hector. They were like incredibly compelling, because it's, and I think it was interesting too in that story, because they are the only mortals, and they understand his quest to essentially bring humanity to its knees, because they've been betrayed by humanity, in a sense. Even to a point where like he doesn't trust the other vampires are essentially just power hungry nobles, and don't really understand Dracula's mission, but his human supporters do, and it's like incredibly compelling to see that relationship kind of develop throughout the story.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a really good example, and I think that makes Dracula a much more multifaceted bad guy. I mean, he's already such a great bad guy, but those interactions, especially those private conversations that he has with those characters when he's recruiting them or asking them for advice, I think do kind of go that extra mile to humanize him, and at the same time show how truly terrible he is.
Yeah.
Right? You see his true self in those conversations, and you see like a man essentially driven to genocide by the death of a single person, right? Which no matter how important that person is, that's ludicrous, right?
Yeah.
That's absolutely psychopathic. But to see it displayed so earnestly, and to see it understood so well, makes them both really excellent bad guys. I agree.
Yeah. And that's it for the guiding questions. But I want to thank you for coming on here for this
absolutely.
month.
I like nothing more than playing the villain. I enjoy being a bad guy in most cases. I find it very rewarding. And I'm going to take the fact that there are 0 questions to mean my answers are so complete and perfect and well understood that there is no more possible information to be gained from me.
Yeah, we've nailed the villain craft. There's nothing more to be explored, actually.
Truly, this is what peak performance looks like. A very tiny cartoon avatar of Knight Solaire on an all-white Discord background.
Yeah, this is it. We nailed it. We nailed it.